Welcome to Ancestors Speak, What Would They Think? The series where we dive into the minds of history's most fascinating figures and imagine how they would react to our modern times, including technology, politics, and popular culture. From abolitionists and philosophers to scientists and politicians, we'll explore what some of the most influential people would say if they were alive today. And let me tell you, these people aren't usually coming from the past to talk sunshine and rainbows. So, let's do it. Let's time travel to hear these ancestors speak.
I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead.
In today's video, we're starting with none other than Frederick Douglass, the legendary abolitionist, orator, writer, and advocate for equality. If anyone knew a thing or two about fighting for freedom and justice, it was Douglass. But how would he view the current state of affairs in America under Trump? And what would he say to us today? But first, who was Frederick Douglass? Frederick Douglass was born into slavery in 1818, but through his fierce intelligence and indomitable spirit, he escaped to freedom. Afterward, he became one of the most powerful voices for the abolition of slavery and the rights of African Americans. Douglass wrote 3 autobiographies, delivered hundreds of speeches, and became a key figure in the abolitionist movement. His powerful words and actions inspired generations to come. He didn't just want freedom for Black Americans, he wanted equality for all people, no matter their race, creed, or class. But how would Douglass view a country that has made so many strides in civil rights, but is still facing systemic racism, inequality, and divisive rhetoric? Well, let's break it down. Number 1. What would Frederick Douglass think about
race relations under Trump?
Douglass was a fierce advocate for racial justice and equality. He fought to end the evils of slavery, but he knew that true freedom went beyond legal abolition. It required equality, dignity, and justice. Fast forward to 2025, and Frederick Douglass would likely be alarmed by Trump's treatment of Black Americans and marginalized communities. Douglass spent his life challenging racism, fighting against systemic oppression, and working towards racial justice. He would absolutely not be a fan of Trump's dismissive comments on race issues. Trump's refusal to fully condemn white supremacy, his divisive rhetoric after events like the George Floyd protests, and his defense of policies that disproportionately harm people of color would likely leave Douglass shaking his head. Douglass would probably say something like, "This is not the progress I had in mind. Did we really just take a giant leap backward?" He'd be calling for comprehensive criminal justice reform, police accountability, and policies that ensure fairness for everyone under the law, especially Black and brown people. Number 2, what would Frederick Douglass think about
immigration in 2025?
Remember, Douglass himself escaped slavery and knew firsthand the importance of freedom and opportunity. Douglass would definitely take issue with Trump's harsh immigration policies, particularly the treatment of refugees and immigrants. Douglass would view Trump's rhetoric about immigrants as a fundamental attack on human rights. He knew that America, at its best, was a refuge for people seeking freedom from oppression. Douglass would likely say, "You cannot call yourself a land of liberty while shutting the door on the oppressed and the poor." Trump's America First policy? Douglass would argue that it contradicts everything he fought for: global solidarity and the dignity of every human being. He'd advocate for a system that welcomes the oppressed, not one that demonizes them. Number 3, what would Frederick Douglass think about
economic inequality and labor rights?
Douglass wasn't just about ending slavery. He was a champion of economic justice, especially for Black Americans who were left to fend for themselves after emancipation. Douglass knew that true freedom meant having the opportunity to live with dignity, to work, and to thrive. Trump's tax cuts for the rich, corporate tax breaks, and the growing economic divide would not sit well with Douglass. He would see these policies as a betrayal of his dream for a nation of economic justice. Douglass would demand an economy that works for everyone, not just the wealthy elite. He'd be calling out the system for stacking the deck against working-class Americans and urging policies that create real economic opportunities for the marginalized. Number 4. What would Frederick Douglass think about
Trump's authoritarian tendencies?
Frederick Douglass was acutely aware of the dangers of unchecked power. Having lived through the horrors of slavery, he knew exactly how dangerous a corrupt authoritarian leader could be. Douglass would be deeply concerned by Trump's attacks on democratic institutions, the media, the courts, and his political opponents. Douglass was a fierce defender of democratic principles, free speech, and the rule of law. Douglass would probably stand up and shout, "This is not what I fought for. This is not the democracy we've built." He would warn against the erosion of democratic norms and the concentration of power in the hands of a single individual. Douglass would insist that the government must be accountable to the people, not to one man. Number 5. What would Frederick Douglass think about
Global justice and solidarity?
Douglass wasn't just an advocate for freedom in America, he was a global champion for justice. He spoke out against imperialism and supported liberation movements worldwide. Trump's America First policy, which often ignores international human rights, would likely clash with Douglass's vision of a world united in the fight for freedom and dignity for all. Douglass would likely urge, America cannot be a beacon of freedom while turning a blind eye to the suffering of others. He would stand for solidarity with oppressed peoples across the globe and argue that America's leadership on the world stage should reflect the highest ideals of liberty and justice. In 2025, Frederick Douglass would look at America under Donald Trump and see a nation drifting away from the core principles he fought for: racial equality, economic justice, democracy, and human rights. Douglass would be critical of Trump's divisive rhetoric, authoritarian leanings, and policies that hurt marginalized communities. But Douglass was never one to give up the fight. He'd call on the American people to rise above division and to renew their commitment to the ideals of liberty, justice, and equality for all. So what would Douglass say if he were here today? He'd likely urge us all to stand together, reject hatred, and work for a future where all people are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. Let's have a listen.
My fellow Americans, I stand before you today as a man who has witnessed firsthand the depths of human suffering, and yet also the heights of human resilience and hope. In my time, I fought for the emancipation of those enslaved, for the fundamental dignity of every human being, and for the right of every citizen to live in liberty and equality. I knew that the struggle for justice would never be easy, but I also knew that without struggle, there would be no progress. Today, I look upon your nation and see that the forces of oppression and division are still at work. The very principles of justice, equality, and freedom for all, principles that I fought for, are now being threatened by the policies and rhetoric of a government that too often seeks to divide rather than unite. Under the leadership of President Trump, we have seen a regression in the fight for racial equality. We have seen the demonization of immigrants and refugees, people who seek only a chance for a better life. We have witnessed policies that prioritize the wealthy over the working poor, and a disregard for the rights of Black Americans and other marginalized groups who still fight for justice and equality in this country. This is not the America that I envisioned, a nation that was meant to be a beacon of hope for all people, regardless of race or background. We must remind ourselves that America's true greatness is not in its wealth or military power, but in its commitment to justice, to human dignity, and to the rights of every person. To President Trump and his supporters, I say this: you may believe that the policies of division, of fear, and of exclusion will strengthen this nation, but they will not. They will only serve to erode the very foundation upon which America stands, the promise of liberty and justice for all. We cannot build a nation on hate, nor can we protect the future of this country by abandoning the ideals of equality and fairness. The progress of the American people, both black and white, rich and poor, is bound together. Your success cannot come at the expense of others' suffering. True greatness comes when we lift each other up, when we create a society in which every person, no matter their skin color, their country of origin, or their economic standing, can live freely, with dignity, and with the hope of opportunity. To those who support the divisive rhetoric of this administration, I ask you, what is your vision of America? Is it a nation that seeks to divide its people by fear and hatred, or one that unites for the common good, that strives to ensure justice for the most oppressed among us? I understand that many of you may feel frustrated, angry, and disillusioned by the system. I too once lived in a system that was built on my oppression, but I did not give in to hatred. I fought for freedom, not by oppressing others, but by embracing the ideals of equality and justice for all. To all Americans, I urge you to turn away from the politics of division and embrace the politics of reconciliation. Let us rise above the rhetoric that seeks to pit us against one another. Let us fight for the rights of all people, Black Americans, immigrants, the poor, the oppressed. Let us demand justice, not just for some, but for everyone. As I said many times, if there is no struggle, there is no progress. But the struggle we face today is not one of color or country. It is the struggle for justice, for fairness, and for the true ideals upon which this nation was built. So, I call upon you, the people of this great land, to demand better from your leaders, to demand a nation where justice prevails for all, where the rich and powerful are held accountable, where the voices of the oppressed are heard, and where the light of freedom shines brightly for every man, woman, and child. This is the America we must build, not the America of division, but the America of justice, not the America of fear, but the America of hope. Thank you.
That's it for today's episode of Ancestors Speak. If you enjoyed this deep dive into Frederick Douglass's perspective, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. And stay tuned for our next episode where we'll be asking, what would Abraham Lincoln think about Donald Trump's plans for the United States? See you next time.